I stood in the hallway shadows, my grip tightening around the cold metal of a USB drive, listening as my husband declared me a traitor to his entire family. He believed slapping divorce papers onto the Thanksgiving dinner table marked the end of our marriage, but he was unaware of the final gift I had prepared. As the screen flickered to life, it was not my reputation that crumbled, but his arrogance, leaving his mother drowning in tears of regret. To understand how it ended like this, I have to take you back to the beginning. My name is Alara Vance. At 32 years old, I had spent the better part of a decade carving out my place in the world, rising to become the creative director at Lumina Nexus, a media conglomerate where perception was everything. I was a woman who built narratives for a living, capable of spinning a PR disaster into a triumph before lunch. Yet, as I parked my rental car at the edge of the Harrington Estate driveway, I was blissfully unaware that the story of my own life was being rewritten without my consent. The Chicago suburbs were wrapped in the biting chill of late November. The sky was a flat, bruised purple, hanging low over the dark waters of the lake that bordered my in-laws' property. The mansion itself, a hulking structure of gray stone and ivy, usually felt imposing. But today I viewed it with a softness that had been absent for months. It was Thanksgiving afternoon, and the air smelled of wet fallen leaves and the faint, acrid tang of wood smoke. I had arrived 4 hours earlier than scheduled, having taken a red-eye flight from Seattle, to my husband, Mark, and his family. I was finishing a grueling business trip that had kept me away for weeks. To me, the trip had been a necessary cover for a secret I had been guarding with ferocious intensity. I was exhausted, a deep, marrow-settling fatigue that made my limbs feel like lead, but my spirit was vibrating with a nervous, electric joy. I paused by the trunk of the car, taking a moment to breathe. My hand drifted instinctively to my stomach, resting over the thick wool of my coat. 4 months. I had hidden the morning sickness, the food aversions, and the changing shape of my body under the guise of work stress and oversized blazers. Today, however, the hiding was over. I had the ultrasound pictures in my bag, ready to be revealed. I imagined the look on Mark's face, the way the lines of worry on his forehead would smooth out when he realized we were finally starting the family he claimed to want so desperately. Instead of walking to the grand oak front doors, I slipped around the side of the house toward the mudroom entrance. I wanted to surprise them. I wanted to walk into the kitchen, smell the roasting turkey, and wrap my arms around Mark before he even knew I was in the state. I turned the key silently in the lock and stepped into the mudroom, shaking the melting snow from my boots. The house should have been filled with the low hum of the football game or the clinking of wine glasses. Instead, it was tense. As I moved toward the kitchen, the smell of sage stuffing and caramelized onions hit me, rich and inviting. A stark contrast to the voices that began to filter through the hallway. They were loud, sharp, and overlapping. I froze in the corridor, just out of sight. It was Mark. He was shouting, his voice strained with a level of vitriol I had never heard him use, not even in our worst arguments. He was speaking to his parents, Evelyn and Thomas. I assumed it was a political disagreement, the kind that often flared up after a few drinks, until I heard my own name. It was not spoken with love or even longing. It was spat out with contempt. My heart hammered against my ribs as the words sank in. The warmth of the kitchen, with its ovens running at full blast and pots simmering on the stove, felt suddenly miles away. Standing there in the shadows of the service hallway, the air around me felt icy, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather outside. I clutched the strap of my bag, the metal digging into my palm, as the festive aroma of the holiday meal mingled sickeningly with the sound of my husband dismantling our marriage. I stood rooted to the hardwood floor behind the partial wall of the mudroom, my breath trapped in my throat. Through the narrow gap in the doorframe, I saw Mark pacing around the kitchen island, his face flushed a violent, blotchy shade of red. He was holding court, presenting his case to his parents like a prosecutor who had lost his grip on reality. "It is Arthur Pendergast." "Mom, it is obvious," Mark sneered, his voice dripping with a mixture of smugness and rage. "The guy is 60 years old, but he has money and power, and apparently that is all Ilara cares about now." Hearing Arthur's name made my stomach turn. Arthur was my mentor, a man who spoke of his grandchildren constantly and treated me like a daughter. The accusation was so grotesque it felt surreal, a twisted fantasy born from a mind I no longer recognized. But Mark was not finished. He began listing his proof, ticking items off on his fingers with manic precision. "She is on the phone at 2 or 3 in the morning. She thinks I am asleep, but I hear her whispering in the bathroom," Mark said, his voice shaking. "And the money. I checked the joint account. She has pulled out $50,000 in the last 4 months. 50,000. She is funneling our savings into some secret life with him." I felt a cold sweat prickle on the back of my neck. The money. The calls. He had seen the actions but completely invented the motive, twisting my labor of love into a sordid affair. "And do not even get me started on the bedroom," Mark continued, his voice dropping to a low, ugly growl that made my skin crawl. "She has not let me touch her in months, always tired, always sick. It is because she is getting it somewhere else. She is repulsed by me because I am not a CEO. Mark, please." Evelyn's voice was trembling, pleading. "Ilara loves you. There must be an explanation. You cannot just assume." "The explanation is that she thinks she is better than me because she brings home a bigger paycheck," Mark shouted, slamming his hand on the granite counter. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "She looks down on me. She thinks I am a failure, so she is climbing the ladder the only way she knows how, with her body." The sound of paper slapping against the table cut through the silence that followed. "I am done being her fool," Mark declared, his voice rising in pitch. "These are signed. I am filing them tomorrow. But first, I am going to handle this tonight. When the aunts and uncles get here, when the house is full, I am going to throw her out. I want everyone to see her for what she really is. I want her to have nowhere to hide. Standing in the shadows, I felt something inside me shatter. It was not my heart. It was the image of the man I thought I married. I realized then that this was not about Arthur. This was not even about the money or the late nights. This was about Mark's own hollow insecurity. He felt small, so he had to make me into a villain to explain why he felt inadequate. His paranoia was a weed that had strangled every good thing between us, and now it had bloomed into this poisonous flower. I had prepared to walk into that room and fix everything. I had the truth in my bag. I could have marched in there, shown them the ultrasound, explained the withdrawals for the lumber mill, and laughed off the late-night calls to the West Coast architects. But as I listened to him plan my public humiliation with such relish, a wave of nausea and absolute clarity washed over me. I did not want to fix this. The man in that kitchen was a stranger who despised me. The love I had carried for him 5 minutes ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve mixed with profound disappointment. I looked down at the key to our home in my hand. It felt heavy, like a burden I no longer wanted to carry. Without making a sound, I placed the key on the small console table in the hallway. It made a soft click against the wood, the only goodbye he deserved. I turned my back on the warmth of the kitchen, on the husband who wanted to destroy me, and on the family that stood by and listened. I walked out the side door and back into the gray, biting afternoon, leaving the door unlocked behind me. I drove blindly toward the Chicago skyline, the towering glass and steel structures offering a strange sense of sanctuary compared to the suffocating atmosphere of the Harrington estate. I did not go to the house Mark and I shared. That place, filled with our wedding photos and the ghost of a happiness that no longer existed, was not a refuge anymore. Instead, I pulled into the valet circle of a high-rise hotel on Michigan Avenue, handing my keys to a stranger with a trembling hand. I booked a suite on the 35th floor, needing to be high above the city, detached from the world that had just crumbled beneath my feet. Once inside the room, I tossed my phone onto the pristine white duvet. It landed face up, the screen immediately lighting up with a barrage of notifications. Mark was relentless. The messages scrolled by in angry bubbles. "Where are you? Do not bother coming back. Everyone knows what you are. Coward." I watched the words appear and disappear, feeling a strange detachment, as if I were observing a specimen under a microscope rather than reading the destruction of my own life. He was so certain of his narrative, so convinced that my absence and secrecy were born of malice. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. For the last 4 months, while he imagined I was tangling sheets with Arthur in some penthouse, I had been covered in sawdust and drywall dust. I had named the secret mission Project Remembrance. It was supposed to be the ultimate gesture of love, a way to restore the one piece of his childhood he mourned the most. Arthur Pendergast was not my lover. He was the only person I trusted to help me navigate the zoning laws and commercial real estate hurdles of buying back the old lumber mill Mark's grandfather had lost to bankruptcy 10 years ago. The late-night calls Mark had cited as evidence of my infidelity were actually conferences with structural engineers in California and Arthur connecting me with contractors who could work miracles on a tight deadline. I had poured $50,000 of our savings into securing the deed and stabilizing the rotting foundation, intending to hand Mark the keys to his dream studio today. I walked into the bathroom and turned on the tap, splashing cold water onto my face. I looked at my reflection in the illuminated mirror. My skin was pale, dark circles bruising the area under my eyes. I placed a hand on my stomach, where a tiny, 16-week-old life was quietly growing. The bump was barely visible, just a slight curvature that I had easily hidden under loose sweaters, but I felt the weight of the secret heavily now. I whispered an apology to the baby, sorry that its father was a man whose fragility had shattered our family before it had even truly begun. Mark wanted a villain. Fine. I would not waste my breath defending myself over text messages he would only twist to fit his paranoid delusions. I would not beg. I wiped my face with a plush towel, the softness contrasting with the hardening resolve in my chest. I walked back into the bedroom and picked up my phone, ignoring Mark's texts and dialing my personal assistant. She answered on the second ring, surprised to hear from me on a holiday. I kept my voice steady, devoid of the tremors that had shaken me in the car. I instructed her to transfer all the raw footage from my private cloud folder, the video diaries, the site visits, the ultrasound clips to a single secure link. She asked no questions, sensing the steel in my tone. For the rest of the night, while the city of Chicago celebrated with turkey and wine, I sat in the blue glow of my laptop screen. I opened the video editing software, a tool I had used 1,000 times for corporate campaigns. This time, however, the product was the truth. I began to piece together the clips, stitching my love and sacrifice into a coherent narrative. It was no longer a gift. As I cut the footage and synced the audio, I realized I was forging a weapon. I would give Mark exactly what he wanted: a full disclosure, broadcast for his entire family to see. As I sat in the hotel room, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating the darkness, I began to dissect the narrative Mark had constructed. It was a fascinating study in paranoia. I laid out his accusations mentally, placing them side by side with the reality I had lived, treating his hysteria like a crime scene that needed reconstruction. First, there was the money. Mark had flagged the withdrawals totaling $50,000 from our joint savings account. In his mind, this was the funding for a secret apartment or lavish gifts for a lover. On my screen, I opened the folder labeled Legal and Property. The money had not disappeared into the ether. It had gone directly to a holding company to secure the deed for the old Harrington Mill. It was a dilapidated structure on the edge of town, the place where Mark had spent his childhood summers before his grandfather went bankrupt. Mark had spoken of that mill with a wistful sadness for years, dreaming of turning it into his own design studio. I had bought it for him. Every cent he thought I was stealing was actually being invested in his dream. Then came the phone calls. Mark claimed I was whispering to Arthur Pendergast in the dead of night. I pulled up my itemized phone bill. The timestamps he cited, specifically the ones at 2 in the morning, matched perfectly with the outgoing calls to the structural architect I had hired in Seattle. The time difference meant that was the only window we could discuss the blueprints without interfering with my day job. The other late-night calls were to the 24-hour nurse line at my OB/GYN's office. I had been terrified during the first trimester, plagued by cramping that I dared not mention to Mark because I wanted the pregnancy to be a safe, confirmed reality before I shared the news. The physical distance was his most damning piece of evidence. He said I flinched when he touched me because I was repulsed by him. I looked at the calendar on my phone, cross-referencing the dates of our worst arguments with my medical journal. I had been suffering from hyperemesis gravidarum, a severe form of morning sickness that left me nauseous 24 hours a day. I had pulled away from his touch not out of disgust, but because the smell of his cologne triggered a gag reflex I was desperately trying to hide. I wanted to give him a perfect, clean reveal on Thanksgiving, a double surprise of the mill and the baby. Instead, my silence had given his insecurity room to fester. That was the crux of it. Mark never asked me a single question. He never said, "Ilara, why are you distant?" He simply filled the silence with his own inadequacies. He had always felt inferior because my career at Lumina Nexus skyrocketed while his architectural firm struggled to find clients. He needed a reason for his feelings of inadequacy, and a cheating wife was a convenient script. I dug deeper into our shared digital history, looking for the catalyst. I found it in an archived email thread between Mark and Jason, a college friend of his who was bitter after 3 divorces. Jason had been dripping poison into Mark's ear for months. There were messages from Jason saying things like, "Women like her do not respect men who earn less," and "check the accounts." Man, she is definitely hiding something. Mark had let a toxic, lonely man dictate the reality of his marriage rather than trusting the woman who slept beside him. I compiled the documents into a new folder, the medical records dating back 16 weeks. The property deed legally registered in the name of Mark Harrington, the invoices for the lumber and the contractor fees. It was all there. Black and white proof that while he was plotting my eviction, I was building his future. I opened my email client and typed Mark's address in the recipient field. My finger hovered over the mouse. I could send this all right now. I could explain everything in a long, heartfelt letter, but then I remembered the look on his face in the kitchen. I remembered the smug satisfaction as he humiliated me in front of his parents. If I sent this email now, he would likely delete it or claim I had forged the documents to save face. He had made our divorce a public spectacle. He had invited an audience to witness my destruction. I closed the email draft without sending it. A private explanation would not suffice. The stain on my reputation was public, so the cleansing had to be public as well. I needed them all to be there. I needed his mother, his father, and all the relatives he had invited to mock me. They needed to see exactly what Mark had thrown away. I turned back to the video editor, my fingers moving with renewed purpose. I was not just editing a video anymore. I was preparing the closing argument for the trial he never knew he was in. For 3 days following the disaster at the Harrington estate, my phone did not stop vibrating. Mark was relentless, shifting tactics from aggression to blackmail with dizzying speed. He left voicemails threatening to expose my alleged affair to the board of directors at Lumina Nexus if I did not sign the divorce papers immediately and waive my right to any marital assets. He was terrified that I would fight him for the house, unaware that I currently had zero interest in the brick and mortar of a home he had already burned to the ground emotionally. The breaking point came on Saturday morning when my mother-in-law, Evelyn, called me. Her voice was thin and trembling, sounding far older than her years. I expected anger, but what I got was a pitiable attempt at mediation based on a lie. "Ilara, honey, she whispered, as if she were afraid Mark might hear her. "Please, just come home and apologize. I know you made a mistake with that man, but Mark is hurting. If you just admit it and promise to change, maybe we can fix this. Marriage is about forgiveness." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Mark had not just misunderstood the situation. He had systematically indoctrinated his family with his delusions. He had painted me as a villain so successfully that his mother was begging me to confess to a sin I had not committed just to soothe his ego. It was a level of manipulation that made me nauseous. I realized then that a private conversation would never clear my name. If I tried to explain the truth to Evelyn one-on-one, Mark would just spin it as more of my deceit. "I will come over," I told Evelyn, my voice steady and devoid of the warmth she was used to. "But I want everyone there. You, Thomas, the aunts, the uncles, everyone who was supposed to be at dinner. I want to settle this once and for all." When I relayed this demand to Mark, he laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. Coming to beg for a settlement in front of an audience, he sneered, "Fine. Sunday afternoon. Bring a pen. And do not think crying in front of my aunt is going to get you a better deal." He thought he had won. He thought I was coming to surrender. I spent the rest of Saturday preparing for war. I hired Julian Sterling, the most ruthless divorce attorney in Chicago. I did not retain him to fight for the bank accounts or the furniture. I hired him to be a professional witness, an impartial observer who would ensure that what happened on Sunday was legally binding and irrefutable. When I told him I did not want a cent of Mark's money, he was confused, but when I explained what I intended to do, he simply nodded and agreed to meet me at the estate. That evening, I sat at the desk in my hotel room and put the finishing touches on the video project. It was exactly 15 minutes long. I watched it one last time, checking the audio levels on the clips of me vomiting in the bathroom and the joyous footage of the lumber mill renovation. It was a masterpiece of tragedy. I saved the file to the USB drive under the name The Thanksgiving Truth. On Sunday morning, I stood before the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at me was not the tired, pregnant wife who had tried to sneak into the kitchen with a surprise. I chose a structured black blazer with sharp shoulders, tailored trousers, and stiletto heels that would click ominously on the Harrington's hardwood floors. I applied my makeup with precision, hiding the dark circles and highlighting the sharp angles of my face. I looked expensive, powerful, and utterly untouchable. I placed the USB drive into my pocket, feeling its cold weight against my hip. I was ready to destroy the lies, even if it meant burning the memory of my marriage to ash in the process. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled up to the Harrington estate for the second time that week. It was 3 p.m. on Sunday, the sky a slate gray that promised snow. The driveway was packed with cars, a testament to Mark's efficiency in gathering an audience. He had not just invited his parents, he had summoned the entire clan. He wanted a public execution of my character, and he had ensured the gallery was full. Walking into the living room felt like stepping onto a stage set for a tragedy. The air was thick, hot, and smelled faintly of stale coffee and heavy perfume. They were all there. Evelyn and Thomas sat on the sofa, looking like mourners at a funeral, their faces drawn and pale. Mark's younger sister, Sarah, leaned against the mantel, her arms crossed over her chest, watching me with a sneer that mirrored her brother's. Behind them stood the extended family aunts, uncles, and cousins I had spent holidays with, people I had bought birthday gifts for, all staring at me with undisguised loathing. To them, I was no longer Alara. I was the adulteress, the gold digger who had broken their golden boy's heart to climb the corporate ladder. Mark sat at the head of the long coffee table, positioned like a judge. He looked rested, smug even. He had shaved and dressed in a crisp button-down shirt, playing the part of the aggrieved but dignified husband to perfection. As I approached, the silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sharp click of my heels on the hardwood floor. I did not greet them. There was no point. The verdict had already been delivered in my absence. Mark slid a thick stack of documents across the polished wood surface toward me. Next to it lay a heavy fountain pen, standard divorce decree and a post-nuptial agreement waiving your rights to any assets acquired during the marriage, Mark said, his voice smooth and loud enough for the back row to hear. I figure we can skip the drama. You sign, you leave, and you can go back to your billionaire boyfriend. Or did Arthur realize you were too much trouble and kick you out already? A ripple of hushed laughter went through the room. Aunt Linda shook her head in disgust, whispering something to her husband about my audacity. I saw Evelyn dab at her eyes with a tissue, unable to look at me. They were eating it up, every word of his scripted humiliation. I did not sit in the empty chair Mark had gestured to. I stood tall, positioned directly in front of the television that dominated the far wall. My posture was rigid, my chin held high, and I refused to look at the papers he had shoved in my direction. I looked down at Mark, meeting his gaze with a cold intensity that made his smirk falter for a fraction of a second. He expected me to cry. He expected me to plead for a payout or scream denials that he could easily shout down. I will sign your papers. Mark, I said, my voice projecting clearly through the cavernous room, devoid of the tremble he was hoping for. I do not want your money. I do not want this house. And I certainly do not want you. The room went deadly quiet. Mark blinked, confused by my lack of resistance regarding the assets. But before I put my name on anything and walk out of this door forever, I continued, reaching into my blazer pocket. You and your family need to understand exactly who you are divorcing. You have told them your story. Now they are going to see the truth. I pulled out the silver USB drive. Mark started to rise from his chair, his brow furrowing as he realized I was not following his script. Ilara, stop it, he warned, his voice dropping an octave. Do not make a scene. Just sign the papers and get out. Sit down, Mark, I commanded, my tone sharp enough to cut glass. I turned to the massive 80-inch screen mounted above the fireplace, ignoring his protest. My hands were steady as I found the port on the side of the panel. I plugged the drive in. The screen flickered from black to the bright blue of the input menu. I could feel the eyes of 20 people boring into my back, a mix of confusion and hostility. I picked up the remote control from the side table and selected the file. You wanted everyone to know what I have been doing for the last 4 months, I said, not looking back at him. So let us show them. I pressed play. The screen flickered to life, bathing the dim living room in a harsh, white glow. The audience, primed for a scandal, leaned forward, expecting grainy footage of a hotel room or a clandestine dinner with a lover. Instead, the speakers crackled with the unmistakable retching sound of someone being violently ill. The video showed me, pale and trembling, slumped against the cold tiles of our master bathroom floor. It was a video diary entry I had recorded on my phone. I looked terrible, with messy hair and dark circles under my eyes. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand and held up a plastic stick toward the camera lens. 2 distinct pink lines were visible even through the shaky focus. July 24th. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read. I heard a sharp intake of breath from the sofa. That was the exact week Mark had told his mother I stopped being intimate with him. The video cut to me whispering to the camera, my voice thick with exhaustion but undeniably happy. I told the camera that the morning sickness was brutal, but it would be worth it to see Mark's face when I told him. The scene shifted. The white tiles were replaced by the gray, overcast sky of the industrial district. I was standing in front of a large, derelict building with broken windows and ivy strangling the brickwork. A few of the older relatives gasped. They recognized it immediately. It was the Harrington Mill, the family legacy that Mark's grandfather had lost to bankruptcy 10 years ago. It was the source of Mark's deepest shame and his fondest childhood memories. In the video, the wind was whipping my hair across my face, but I was grinning. I spoke directly to the lens, addressing Mark. I told him that I knew he still dreamed about this place. I said that I had finally secured the loan and that this was his Thanksgiving present. I told him that I wanted our child to grow up running through the same halls he did. Mark shifted in his chair, his posture losing its rigid arrogance. He looked like he had been struck. The video cut again to the interior of the mill. Standing there, wearing a hard hat and pointing at a blueprint spread over a sawhorse, was Arthur Pendergast. The man Mark had accused of seducing me looked every bit his 60 years. He was not touching me. He was lecturing me. Arthur pointed a stern finger at the camera and told me to sit down. He called me his stubborn niece and said that he would not have me fainting on his watch. He told me that the structural integrity of the East Wing was sound, but I needed to stop worrying about the budget and start worrying about my blood pressure. He mentioned that his wife had sent over some ginger tea for my nausea. The image dissolved into a slideshow of high-resolution documents. They remained on the screen long enough for everyone to read the fine print. Bank transfer receipts totaled $50,000, the exact amount Mark had accused me of stealing. The recipient was the county clerk's office. Then came the deed to the property. The camera zoomed in on the owner line. It did not say Alara Vance. It read Mark Harrington in bold black letters. The room was dead silent. Not a single person moved. The video returned to motion. I was inside the mill again, wearing paint-splattered overalls that were unbuttoned at the sides to accommodate my waist. I was painting a small office room a soft, slate blue. I turned to the camera, wiping sweat from my forehead with a forearm. I looked exhausted, but my eyes were shining. I said that this was going to be his office. I said that I could not wait to see him sitting at his grandfather's desk again. The final clip played. It was recorded just 2 days ago, in the hotel room where I had hidden from Mark's rage. I was holding a black and white sonogram photo against my chest. I looked straight into the camera, my expression soft and full of a love that now felt like a ghost. I smiled, a tear tracking down my cheek on the screen. I said, "Congratulations, Daddy Mark." I told him we were 16 weeks along. I said that we were finally a family. The video ended, the screen fading to black, leaving only the reflection of Mark's horrified face staring back at him. The silence that followed the sudden darkness of the television screen was heavier than the air in the room. It pressed down on us, suffocating and absolute, a physical weight that made it difficult to breathe. The blue light from the input menu cast long, ghostly shadows across the frozen faces of my in-laws, illuminating the shock that had paralyzed them in their seats. For a moment, time seemed to suspend, trapping us all in the wreckage of the truth I had just detonated. Evelyn was the first to break. It started as a low, strangled whimper, a sound so raw it made the hair on my arms stand up. Then, she clapped a hand over her mouth, her shoulders heaving as a sob tore through her chest. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a horror that went beyond simple embarrassment. She was realizing in real time that she had counseled a woman carrying her grandchild to apologize for a sin that never happened, and that she had aided her son in persecuting the only person who was actually fighting for their family. I turned my gaze to Mark. The smug, self-righteous man who had sat at the head of the table 5 minutes ago was gone. In his place sat a shell. His face had drained of all color, turning the waxy gray of a corpse. His hands, which had been so steady when he pushed the divorce papers toward me, were now trembling violently against the mahogany wood. He stared at the blank screen as if he could burn the images back into existence, his mouth slightly open, struggling to process the magnitude of his error. Thomas did not look at the screen. He looked at his son. I had never seen such profound disappointment in a father's eyes. It was a quiet, crushing weight. He looked from Mark to the deed I held in my hand, realizing that the family legacy he had failed to protect, the mill he had lost to debt and bad luck, had been redeemed not by his son, but by the daughter-in-law they had all just spat upon. I walked forward, the sound of my heels striking the floor like gavel blows. I reached into my bag and pulled out the physical copies of the documents shown in the video. The medical file, thick with 16 weeks of history. The deed to the mill, stamped and notarized. I tossed them onto the coffee table. They landed with a heavy thud, sliding across the polished surface until they rested directly beside the divorce papers and the aggressive post-nuptial agreement Mark had been so eager for me to sign. I was not having an affair. "Mark," I said. My voice was calm, terrifyingly even to my own ears. "I was not stealing your money. I was not laughing at you with Arthur. I was only trying to make your dream come true." The sound of my voice seemed to snap Mark out of his trance. He scrambled forward, nearly knocking his heavy oak chair over. His eyes locked onto the ultrasound photo that had slipped out of the medical folder. He reached for it with desperate, clumsy fingers, clutching the glossy paper as if it were a lifeline. "Ilara," he gasped, his voice cracking. He looked up at me, tears pooling in his eyes, his face a mask of panic and dawning grief. He reached out his other hand, trying to grasp my fingers, trying to bridge the chasm he had dug between us. "Ilara, I did not know. I swear to you, I did not know." I took a step back. The movement was small, but it was final. I watched his hand grasp at the empty air where I had just been. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized with a jolt that I felt nothing. No anger, no love, just a cold, hollow distance. He was a stranger to me, a man whose insecurity had turned him into a monster who would cannibalize his own wife to feed his ego. "Do not touch me," I said, my voice devoid of heat but hard as iron. I refused to let him contaminate the dignity I had left. Mark crumbled before my eyes. It was a physical collapse, as if the strings holding up his marionette body had been severed all at once. He dropped to his knees on the Persian rug, the expensive fabric muffling the impact, and grabbed the hem of my trousers like a drowning man clutching at driftwood. Tears were streaming down his face, ruining the facade of the composed, successful architect he had tried so hard to project just minutes ago. "Ilara, please," he sobbed, his voice wet and desperate. "You have to understand, I was under so much pressure. The firm was struggling, and you were flying so high. I felt like I was disappearing. I was terrified. I thought I was losing you to a better life, to a better man." He looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen, searching for a flicker of the empathy I had always given him in the past. "It was because I love you so much," he choked out. "I was crazy with jealousy because the thought of you with him made me want to die. I did this because I love you. Ilara." I stared down at the man I had vowed to spend my life with, and I felt a wave of icy clarity wash over me. His confession did not move me. It revolted me. "That is not love. Mark," I said, cutting through his sobbing with surgical precision. "Love is trust. Love is asking a question before you build a coffin for your marriage. What you have is not love. It is possession. You did not want to keep me. You wanted to own me. And because you felt like you were losing control, you decided to destroy me rather than talk to me. That is not love. That is abuse." Before Mark could respond, Evelyn rushed forward. She threw her arms around me, burying her face in my shoulder, weeping openly. The scent of her lavender perfume, once comforting, now felt suffocating. "Ilara, darling, please," she begged, her voice muffled against my blazer. "Do not do this. Think of the baby. We can fix this. We will go to therapy. We will make it right. You cannot take my grandchild away from his father." I looked at the woman who had been a second mother to me for 5 years. Just moments ago, she had sat in silence while her son called me a whore. She had believed the worst of me without ever picking up the phone to ask for my side of the story. I reached up and gently, but firmly, removed her hands from my shoulders. I stepped back, creating a physical distance that matched the emotional chasm between us. "You did not think about the baby when you sat there and let him humiliate me. Evelyn," I said softly. "You believed his lies instantly. You judged me. You condemned me. You did not ask me a single question. Trust is not something you can resurrect once you have murdered it. It is dead. I turned back to the coffee table. The divorce papers were still there, waiting. The black fountain pen Mark had offered me with such arrogance earlier lay beside them. I picked it up. The weight of it felt significant in my hand, like a weapon. The room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Every eye was fixed on my hand. I did not hesitate. I flipped to the signature page, the paper crisp under my fingers. With bold, sweeping strokes, I signed my name on the line. Elara Vance, not Harrington. I was reclaiming myself. I capped the pen with a sharp click that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I pushed the signed papers toward Mark, who was still kneeling on the floor, staring up at me in paralyzed horror. Next to the divorce decree, I placed the deed to the lumber mill. "The mill is yours," I said, looking down at him one last time. "Consider it a parting gift. I paid for the land and the renovations. It is debt-free. You finally have your legacy back. Mark. I hope it keeps you warm at night." I turned to leave, adjusting my bag on my shoulder. "As for the baby," I added, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "My lawyer will be in touch regarding custody and support. Do not contact me directly." I walked toward the door. Behind me, a sound tore through the air that I would remember for the rest of my life. It was a guttural, animalistic scream of pure despair. Mark had looked at the papers. He had seen my signature. He had realized, in that single devastating moment, that his paranoia had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. He had held the perfect life in his hands, a wife who loved him, a child on the way, and his dream studio restored, and he had smashed it to pieces with his own fear. As his wails filled the house, echoing off the high ceilings of the mansion, I did not look back. The heavy oak front door of the Harrington estate clicked shut behind me with a finality that echoed in my bones. Stepping out onto the porch, the biting November wind whipped against my face, stinging my cheeks and messing up my hair. But for the first time in months, I did not feel cold. I felt an immense, soaring sense of lightness. It was as if I had been carrying a backpack full of stones up a mountain for years, and I had finally shrugged it off at the summit. The air tasted sharp and clean, devoid of the suffocating scent of deception and judgment that filled the house behind me. I walked briskly toward my car, my heels crunching on the gravel driveway. I had just reached the driver's side door when I heard frantic footsteps behind me. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. Mark was running toward me, stumbling in his haste, his shirt untucked and his face a ruin of tears and snot. He looked pathetic, a shadow of the arrogant man who had tried to destroy me less than an hour ago. "Elara, wait," he screamed, his voice cracking. "Please, just wait." I opened the car door and slid into the leather seat. I pulled the door shut and pressed the lock button immediately. The mechanical thud of the locks engaging was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Mark reached the car a second too late. He grabbed the handle, pulling on it uselessly, then pressed his palms against the window. He was shouting something about love, about mistakes, about how he could fix everything, but his voice was muffled by the glass, reduced to insignificant background noise. I did not roll down the window. I did not look him in the eye. I simply pressed the ignition button, and the engine purred to life, steady and reliable. I shifted the gear into drive and eased the car forward, forcing him to step back or be run over. As I rolled down the long driveway, I glanced into the rearview mirror for one last look. It was a tableau of absolute misery. Evelyn had come out onto the porch and was collapsing into Thomas's arms, her body shaking with sobs. Mark was standing in the middle of the driveway, his arms hanging limp at his sides, watching the taillights of his life fade away. He looked small. He looked like a child who had broken his favorite toy and was only now realizing it could never be put back together. I expected to feel a surge of vindictive triumph, a rush of gloating satisfaction at their suffering, but as I turned onto the main road, leaving the estate behind, I realized I felt none of that. I did not feel hate. I did not feel spite. I felt a crystal clear realization of my own worth. I had walked into a den of wolves who wanted to tear me apart, and I had walked out without a scratch, leaving them to choke on the truth. The lumber mill, the money, the years of effort, it was a high price to pay, but it was the cost of my freedom, and it was worth every penny. I drove past the turnoff for the old mill, the building standing silent and renovated in the distance. I did not feel a pang of loss. It was Mark's dream, not mine. Let him have it. Let him sit in that office I painted for him and think about the wife and child who would never walk through the door. I took one hand off the steering wheel and placed it gently on my stomach. The life growing inside me fluttered, a tiny, reassuring movement. "We are going to be okay," I whispered to the empty car, my voice strong and steady. "You and me. We are going to be just fine, and I promise you, little one, we will never let anyone treat us like we are small ever again." My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I glanced at the screen. It was a text from Julian Sterling, my lawyer. It was short and professional. "The filing is active." "We have started the process." I did not reply. Instead, I picked up the phone and held down the power button. I watched the screen go black, cutting off the connection to Mark, to his weeping mother, and to the chaos I had left in my wake. I did not need to hear their apologies or their excuses. I merged onto the highway, the city of Chicago rising in the distance like a beacon of steel and light. I was driving toward a future that belonged entirely to me. I was no longer a supporting character in Mark's insecure drama. I was the protagonist of my own life, driving fast, breathing deep, and absolutely free. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please let me know in the comments section down below where you are tuning in from to hear this. I would love to read your thoughts and connect with you all. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.